The makeup artist stepped back and looked at her work. "What do you think?" she asked, handing Snoop Dogg a small mirror. Snoop turned his face from side to side, barely recognizing himself. His normally neat braids were hidden under a matted wig. His smooth skin now looked weathered and rough. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by layers of tattered, stained garments that hung loose on his tall frame. "Dang," Snoop said quietly. "My own mama wouldn't know me." He was sitting in a trailer parked in an empty lot. Outside, the California sun was setting. Inside, a small team of people moved around nervously, checking cameras and microphones. "You sure about this?" asked his longtime friend and bodyguard. He'd been against the idea from the start. "We can still call it off." Snoop shook his head. "Nah, man, this needs to happen." 3 weeks earlier, Snoop had been scrolling through his phone when he came across a video. It showed police officers forcing a homeless man to dump out his few belongings onto the sidewalk. The man was crying, begging them to stop. The video had gotten millions of views, with people arguing in the comments about whether the police were just doing their job or being cruel. That night, Snoop couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that man, about how people treated him like he wasn't even human. The next morning, he called his manager with an idea. "I want to become homeless for a day," he'd said. "For real, no fancy cameras following me around. Hidden ones. I want to see how the cops treat me when they don't know I'm Snoop Dogg." His team had tried to talk him out of it. It was risky. What if something went wrong? What if someone recognized him? But Snoop was stubborn when he believed in something. Now, as the makeup artist added some final touches to make his skin look dirty, Snoop went over the plan one more time with the director, a woman who had made documentaries about poverty in America. "We've got hidden cameras here, here, and here," she said, pointing to spots on a small map. "We've got people pretending to be regular folks with phones who can record if anything happens. And you've got the button camera on your jacket and the mic sewn into your collar." Snoop nodded. "And you're gonna stay back, right? I need this to be real. No interference unless things get dangerous." The director looked worried but agreed. "The safety word is milestone. Say that, and we'll step in immediately." Snoop's personal doctor, a short man with thick glasses, handed him a small pill. "This will make you smell, well, not great, like you haven't showered in a while. It's harmless but helps with the authenticity." As the sun disappeared completely, Snoop stood up. He practiced his walk, not his usual confident stride, but a shuffling step with slightly hunched shoulders. He practiced speaking in a rough, quiet voice, nothing like his famous smooth drawl. "Spare some change," he mumbled, holding out a shaking hand. Then he shook his head. "Nah, more tired. Like this. Spare change, please." His voice cracked on the last word. His friend handed him a shopping cart filled with empty bottles, old blankets, and random items they'd carefully selected to look like collected trash, but actually contain nothing dangerous or illegal. 24 hours, Snoop said, gripping the handle of the cart. "I'll be back here tomorrow night." The director handed him a worn backpack with a few bottles of water hidden in the bottom, a basic phone for emergencies only, and a small amount of cash. "Remember," she said, "you're not trying to trick anybody or make them look bad. You're just trying to experience what it's really like." Snoop nodded. He took a deep breath and looked at himself one last time in the mirror. The famous rapper had disappeared. In his place was just another forgotten person that most people would cross the street to avoid. "Let's do this," he said, and pushed the squeaky cart toward the door. Outside, the streets of Los Angeles waited. The same streets he'd grown up on, the same streets he now drove through in luxury cars. Tonight, he'd see them from a whole different view. As he shuffled away from the trailer, he already felt different. A couple walking by glanced at him and quickly looked away, pulling each other closer as they passed. Snoop felt it immediately, that feeling of becoming invisible and scary at the same time. "This gonna be a long night," he muttered to himself as he pushed his cart toward the neighborhood where he planned to begin his experiment. The hidden camera captured his eyes, still his own despite all the makeup, and in them was determination mixed with genuine concern about what he was about to learn. The streetlights flickered on as Snoop pushed his cart down the cracked sidewalk. The evening air was getting cooler, and he pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. He was heading toward Long Beach, not far from where he grew up. The familiar streets looked different from this new perspective. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing and talking loudly. When they spotted Snoop, their laughter died down. They moved to the other side of the street, throwing nervous glances his way. Snoop felt a strange pain in his chest. Just an hour into his experiment, and he was already feeling what it was like to be feared and avoided. "It's like I'm a ghost," he muttered to himself, making sure the hidden microphone caught his words. "People look through me, not at me." He pushed his cart toward a small park where he'd heard homeless people sometimes gathered. As he approached, he saw about a dozen people with their own carts and makeshift shelters. Some were talking in small groups, while others sat alone, staring into space. Snoop hesitated. This wasn't part of the act anymore. These were real people struggling with real problems. Was he wrong to pretend to be one of them? But then he reminded himself why he was doing this: to understand, not to mock. He shuffled toward an empty bench and sat down, keeping his cart close. An older man with a gray beard nodded at him from a few feet away. "New around here?" the man asked. Snoop nodded, trying to remember his backstory. "Yeah, lost my place last month. Been moving around." The man introduced himself as Bobby. "First night's the hardest," he said. "Gets a little easier after that. Not much, but a little." Bobby didn't ask for Snoop's story, and Snoop was grateful. Instead, Bobby shared some practical advice: which areas were safer to sleep in, which store owners might give away food at closing time, which public bathrooms stayed open all night. "Cops usually do a sweep around midnight," Bobby warned. "They'll move you along if you're in the wrong spot. Be polite, don't argue, just go. Find somewhere else." Snoop listened, taking in every word. He'd expected to learn about police behavior, but he was learning so much more. Bobby had been living on the streets for 3 years after losing his job and then his apartment. He spoke matter-of-factly about his situation, without self-pity. As the night grew darker, more people arrived at the park. A woman in her 50s handed out sandwiches she'd made. She gave one to Snoop with a kind smile. "Peanut butter and jelly," she said. "Hope that's okay." Snoop thanked her, surprised by the small act of kindness. He took a bite, suddenly realizing how hungry he was. The simple sandwich tasted better than any fancy meal he'd had in a long time. A young woman who couldn't have been more than 20 was sitting under a tree nearby, sketching in a small notebook. Curious, Snoop moved closer. She was drawing the park, capturing the faces of the people around her with incredible detail. "Those are really good," Snoop said. The woman looked up, startled. Then she relaxed a little. "Thanks. Used to study art before, you know," she shrugged. "Still like to draw. Keeps me sane." She showed him more of her sketches, scenes of street life drawn with a cheap ballpoint pen. They were beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Snoop wondered how many talented people were out here, their gifts hidden behind labels like homeless or vagrant. Around 10 o'clock, people started settling in for the night. Bobby showed Snoop a spot behind some bushes where they could set up cardboard boxes as shelter. "Not too visible from the street," he explained. "Cops might leave us alone." As Snoop arranged his cardboard, he noticed how everyone had their own routine. Some carefully unpacked their few possessions, arranging them in a specific order. Others wrapped themselves in layers of blankets despite the mild night. A few talked quietly, sharing stories or just keeping each other company. "Been out here long?" a soft voice asked. It was an elderly woman setting up her spot nearby. "First night," Snoop admitted. She nodded sympathetically. "Gets cold around 3 in the morning. Put your cardboard under you, not just over you. Ground steals your heat." These small acts of kindness and shared wisdom touched Snoop deeply. He'd expected to be alone in his experiment, but instead, he'd found a community, people helping each other survive. As he lay down on his piece of cardboard, staring up at the stars barely visible through the city lights, Snoop thought about his comfortable bed at home. He thought about how easy it had been for him to become homeless for a day, knowing he could go back to his real life tomorrow. These people didn't have that choice. A police siren wailed in the distance, and Snoop saw several people tense up. The sound grew louder, then faded as the car passed by without stopping. "Just the first warning," Bobby whispered from his spot. "They'll be back." Snoop pulled his thin blanket tighter and waited, his heart beating faster than he expected. The experiment had barely begun, and already his perspective was changing. He wasn't just learning about how police treated the homeless, he was learning what it meant to be invisible in a city full of people. Snoop had just started to drift off to sleep when the bright beam of a flashlight swept across his face. He squinted against the harsh light, hearing the crunch of boots on gravel. His heart jumped in his chest as he realized what was happening. "Here we go," he whispered to himself, making sure the hidden microphone picked up his words. Two police officers stood a few feet away, their flashlights pointed at the small group of homeless people. Bobby was already sitting up, calmly gathering his few belongings. Others were doing the same, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been through this many times before. "Evening, officers," Bobby said politely. One of the officers, a tall man with broad shoulders, nodded at him. "Bobby, you know the drill. Park closes at 10. The second officer, shorter with a buzz cut, moved closer to where Snoop was still lying on his cardboard. He directed his flashlight right into Snoop's face. "You! Up! Let's see some ID." Snoop slowly sat up, keeping his head down and his hands visible like Bobby had advised. He blinked against the bright light, trying to see the officer's face but couldn't make out much. "Don't have ID," Snoop mumbled, making his voice rough and quiet. "Lost my wallet last month." The officer sighed. "What's your name?" "Calvin," Snoop answered, using his real first name but changing his last. "Calvin Johnson." "Mr. Johnson, the park is closed. You can't stay here." Snoop nodded, gathering up his blanket. "Where am I supposed to go?" The question hung in the air. The taller officer stepped closer. "There's a shelter on Alameda. About 3 miles east. They might have beds." "Might?" Snoop asked. "Gets full fast," the officer admitted. "But they have coffee and a place to sit even if all the beds are taken." The way he said it wasn't unkind. Snoop looked more closely at the officer's face. He looked tired, not angry or disgusted. Just a man doing his job at midnight, moving along people who had nowhere else to go. Snoop stood up slowly, leaning on his shopping cart. "I'll head that way." Bobby and the others were already shuffling toward the park exit. The officers watched, not rushing them, but making it clear they needed to leave. As Snoop pushed his cart past the officers, the shorter one suddenly asked, "You need medical attention. You're limping." Snoop hadn't realized he was still walking with his fake limp. "Nah, old injury. Acts up in the cold." The officer nodded. "If you do need help, county hospital has to treat you. Remember that." It was a small thing, that bit of information, but it surprised Snoop. The officer wasn't being friendly exactly, but he wasn't being cruel either. He was treating Snoop like a person who might need help. Once they were outside the park gates, Bobby turned to Snoop. "Those two are okay. Officer Rivera and Officer Chen. They do the night shift here most days. They're fair." Snoop glanced back at the officers, who were now checking another part of the park. "They know you by name." Bobby shrugged. "Been moved along by them so many times, we got familiar. They're not like some of the day shift guys. Those ones can be rough." The small group split up at the street corner. Some headed toward downtown, others toward the industrial area where they said there were empty loading docks to sleep under. Bobby pointed east. "That shelter they mentioned is real, but Bobby's right, probably full by now. There's an underpass about a mile that way. Not comfortable, but the cops don't usually bother you there." Snoop thanked him for the advice. As he pushed his cart down the darkened street, he thought about the officers. They had been professional, even somewhat helpful. They hadn't touched his belongings or made him feel less than human. Was that the normal experience, or had he gotten lucky? He decided to head toward the underpass Bobby had mentioned. As he walked, the streets grew quieter. Few cars passed by. The ones that did sometimes slowed down, their drivers staring at him with curiosity or suspicion before speeding up again. A police car cruised past, different officers from the ones in the park. They slowed down as they passed Snoop, the spotlight from their vehicle briefly illuminating him. He kept his head down and continued walking. The car drove on. When he finally reached the underpass, Snoop found about 20 people already settled there. Some had tents, others just blankets spread on the hard ground. A few small fires burned in metal trash cans, giving off weak light and little heat. An older woman wearing several layers of clothes waved him over to a spot near one of the fires. "First time here?" she asked. Snoop nodded. "Stay close to the wall," she advised. "Sometimes kids drive by and throw things." Snoop thanked her and set up his spot where she suggested. He was exhausted but found it hard to relax. Every sound made him tense. Cars passing overhead, people moving around in the darkness, distant sirens. He lay down but stayed awake, watching and listening. His mind kept going back to those officers in the park. They hadn't been heroes, but they hadn't been villains either. They were just doing their job, trying to follow rules that didn't offer real solutions to anyone. The woman near the fire started coughing, a deep, painful sound that echoed under the concrete bridge. Nobody rushed to help her. Nobody called an ambulance. After a while, the coughing stopped, and she settled back into her nest of blankets. Snoop reached for the emergency phone hidden in his backpack. For a moment, he thought about calling it all off. This experiment suddenly felt too real, too painful. The hidden cameras couldn't capture the feeling in his chest. The mix of fear, sadness, and anger had a system that left people sleeping under bridges, while police officers could only offer directions to shelters that were already full. But he put the phone back without using it. He had come to learn, and he was learning. The first police encounter had been calm, even respectful. But that woman's cough, the children who might drive by to throw things at homeless people for fun, the cold concrete under his back, those were teaching him things too. He pulled his blanket tighter and prepared for a long, sleepless night. The first test with the police had gone better than he expected. But somehow that didn't make him feel any better about what he was witnessing. Snoop woke up with the sun in his eyes and pain in his back. He hadn't really slept, just dozed off for short periods throughout the night. The concrete under him felt like it had become harder as the hours passed. Around him, people were already moving, packing up their few belongings before the morning traffic got heavy. "Gotta clear out before rush hour," the older woman from last night told him. "City workers come through with hoses if we stay too long." Snoop's body ached as he stood up. His experiment was less than halfway done, but he already felt worn down. He thought about his comfortable bed at home, the hot shower he could be taking right now. Then he looked around at the people who didn't have that choice, who woke up like this every day with nowhere better to go. "You heading downtown?" Bobby asked, appearing suddenly beside him. "Better spots to get some food there." Snoop nodded, grateful for the guidance. He pushed his cart alongside Bobby's as they walked. The morning was chilly, and his thin jacket didn't do much to keep out the cold. His stomach growled loudly. "Church on 8th gives out breakfast," Bobby said. "Nothing fancy, coffee and donuts mostly, but it'll fill you up." They made their way slowly toward downtown. As the streets got busier with morning commuters, Snoop noticed how people's eyes slid past them. It was like they had some kind of magic power that made them invisible, or more accurately, that made people want them to be invisible. At the church, a line had already formed. Volunteers handed out coffee in paper cups and donuts in napkins. One woman smiled at Snoop as she gave him his food, looking him directly in the eyes. It almost startled him after hours of being purposely unseen. "God bless you," she said. Snoop mumbled thanks, surprised by how much that simple acknowledgement meant to him. After eating, Bobby headed toward the recycling center to cash in some bottles he'd collected. Snoop decided to try another part of his experiment. He found a busy corner near some shops and sat down with his back against a wall. He placed his empty coffee cup in front of him and watched people walk by. For the first hour, only one person dropped a quarter into his cup. Most people walked by without looking down. Some crossed the street when they saw him. A few frowned, as if his presence was offensive. Snoop kept his head down but watched everything through his eyelashes. Around 9 a.m., he noticed a shop owner standing in a doorway, glaring at him. The man was middle-aged with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. After a few minutes, he walked over. "You can't sit here," he said. "You're scaring away my customers." Snoop looked up. "I'm not doing anything wrong, just sitting here." The shop owner's face hardened. "I don't care. Move along or I'm calling the cops." Snoop didn't move. He wasn't actually breaking any laws by sitting on a public sidewalk, but the shop owner was already pulling out his phone. Snoop heard him complain about a homeless guy harassing people, even though Snoop hadn't spoken to anyone. 20 minutes later, a police car pulled up to the curb. Two officers got out, not the same ones from the park. These officers were younger, and as they approached, Snoop could see their faces were already set with annoyance. "Stand up," the first officer ordered without introducing himself. Snoop slowly got to his feet, keeping his hands visible. "ID," the second officer demanded. "Don't have any," Snoop answered. The first officer sighed loudly. "Course you don't. What's your name?" "Calvin Johnson," Snoop said again. "Mr. Johnson, we've had complaints about you harassing customers. You need to move along." Snoop looked directly at the officer. "I wasn't harassing anyone, just sitting here quietly." The second officer stepped closer. "Doesn't matter. You can't loiter here. This is a business district." "Where am I supposed to go?" Snoop asked. It was the same question he'd asked the officers in the park, but this time the response was very different. "Not my problem," the officer said flatly. "Just can't be here." The shop owner was watching from his doorway, a satisfied look on his face. Snoop realized this was probably a regular occurrence. The man calls the police move the homeless people away, and everyone pretends the problem is solved when really it's just been pushed somewhere else. "I'm not breaking any laws," Snoop said. The officer's face changed, hardening. "You want to push this, because I can run you for warrants. Or maybe search that card of yours. Bet we'd find something interesting." The threat was clear. Snoop felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd been treated with basic respect by the first officers, but these two were different. They saw him as a problem to be solved, not a person in a difficult situation. People were starting to notice the confrontation. Some had stopped to watch. Others were filming with their phones. The officers noticed too, and their demeanor changed slightly. "Look," the first officer said, his voice suddenly more reasonable. "There's a day center 3 blocks that way. They've got bathrooms, water. You can rest there for a while." It was the first helpful thing either of them had said, but Snoop suspected it was only because people were watching now. As if confirming his thoughts, the second officer muttered under his breath, "Cameras everywhere these days." Snoop picked up his cup with the quarter in it and moved toward his shopping cart. "I'll go to the day center," he said. As he pushed his cart away, he could feel the officers watching him. He could also feel the eyes of the bystanders, some curious, some concerned, most just briefly interested in the small drama before continuing with their days. Once he was around the corner, Snoop stopped and whispered into his hidden microphone. That was different. Those cops started with threats. Only changed when people started filming. Wonder if the cameras weren't there if they would have searched my stuff or worse. Didn't offer help until they had an audience. He pushed his cart toward the day center, thinking about the difference between the night officers and these morning ones. Same job, same city, but completely different approaches. One pair saw homeless people as humans in a tough spot who needed somewhere to go. The other saw them as problems to be removed, pushed away, hidden. And all because a shop owner didn't want someone sitting near his store. All because his presence might make customers uncomfortable. The hidden cameras had captured it all. Snoop hoped the footage would show people what he was experiencing, not just the treatment from police, but the way society looked through him, past him, around him. The way his very existence was seen as a problem to be solved rather than a person who needed help. And his experiment was only halfway done. The day center was crowded but clean. Snoop found a quiet corner to sit and observe. Around him, people were washing up in the bathrooms, charging phones, or simply resting in plastic chairs. A small TV mounted on the wall played the local news with the volume turned low. No one paid much attention to it or to him. For the first time since starting his experiment, Snoop felt something close to safe. Here, he wasn't being stared at or ignored or moved along. He was just another person taking a break from the streets. An older man with a staff badge approached him. "First time here?" he asked kindly. Snoop nodded. "Lunch is at noon. We've got clean socks if you need them, and the shower sign-up is over by the front desk." The man's voice was matter-of-fact but friendly. "I'm Joe, by the way. Holler if you need anything." Joe didn't wait for Snoop to share his name or story. He just moved on to the next person. Snoop appreciated that. No pressure, just basic human kindness. Around 11:30, the center got busier as more people came in hoping for lunch. Snoop decided to head back outside. He wanted to test how different areas of the city might treat him differently. His cart was safely stored in the center's locked storage area, so he walked with just his backpack, heading toward a public park downtown. The park was busy with office workers having lunch on benches. Snoop found an empty spot and sat down, stretching his legs. His whole body ached from the night sleeping on concrete. He closed his eyes for a moment, just feeling the sun on his face. "Sir, sir." Snoop opened his eyes to see a park security guard standing over him. "You can't sleep here," the guard said. "Wasn't sleeping," Snoop replied. "Just resting my eyes." The guard looked skeptical. "Well, don't. No sleeping in the park." As the guard walked away, Snoop sighed. He couldn't even close his eyes for a minute without someone assuming the worst. He wondered how many rules existed specifically to keep homeless people uncomfortable and unwelcome in public spaces. He was about to get up and move when he noticed a police car pull up to the park entrance. His heart sank. Was the security guard really calling the police just because he closed his eyes? 2 officers got out and scanned the park. They spoke briefly to the security guard, who pointed in Snoop's direction. But instead of coming straight to him, they stopped to talk to some other people first. They seemed to be asking questions, not making arrests or moving people along. Finally, they approached Snoop. One of them, a tall woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked at him with a mixture of concern and authority. "Good afternoon," she said. "We're looking into a reported disturbance in this area. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Snoop shrugged. "No disturbance here, just sitting." The second officer, a man with lieutenant stripes on his uniform, hung back slightly, studying Snoop with narrowed eyes. Something about the way he was staring made Snoop nervous. Was his disguise slipping? Had the officer recognized him? "Have you been in this park long?" the female officer asked. "Maybe 15 minutes," Snoop answered truthfully. The lieutenant stepped closer, his head tilted slightly to one side. "Sir, could you look at me directly for a moment?" Snoop hesitated. He'd been keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact as Bobby had advised. But now he slowly raised his eyes to meet the lieutenant's gaze. The lieutenant's expression changed instantly. His eyes widened, and he looked quickly at his partner, then back at Snoop. "Wait a minute," he said quietly. "Are you?" He didn't finish the sentence, but Snoop could see the recognition in his eyes. Keeping in character, Snoop frowned. "Am I what?" The lieutenant cleared his throat. "Officer Lee, could I have a word with you?" Both officers stepped away, speaking in hushed tones. Snoop could see the female officer's surprise as the lieutenant whispered something to her. She looked back at Snoop, then quickly looked away when she realized he was watching. When they returned, everything about their demeanor had changed. The brusqueness was gone, replaced by an almost nervous politeness. "Sir, is everything all right?" the lieutenant asked, his voice now much friendlier. "Is there anything we can help you with today?" Snoop was amazed at the transformation. One minute he was a potential troublemaker, the next he was someone to be helped, all because the lieutenant had recognized him beneath the disguise. "I'm fine," Snoop said, still maintaining his character. "Just resting before I move on." "Take all the time you need," the lieutenant said quickly. "This is a public park. You have every right to be here." Snoop nearly laughed at the sudden change. The security guard who had just told him not to close his eyes was watching from a distance, clearly confused by the officer's respectful treatment. Actually, the female officer added, "There's a community outreach event happening 2 blocks over. Free food, services may be worth checking out." She sounded genuinely helpful now. The lieutenant took out a small notepad and wrote something down. He handed the paper to Snoop. "My direct number," he said quietly. "If you need anything at all." Snoop took the paper, his mind racing. The experiment had just taken an unexpected turn. The lieutenant had somehow seen through his disguise, or at least suspected who he might be. How would this affect his findings? Did it invalidate everything if he was recognized? As the officers walked away, he could hear them still whispering. The female officer glanced back once more, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Snoop sat for a few more minutes, processing what had just happened. Then he gathered his things and headed back toward the day center. He needed to get his cart and continue the experiment in a different area, away from these officers who now knew his secret. As he walked, he whispered into his microphone, "Something just changed. That lieutenant figured me out. Didn't say it directly, but I know he knows." And just like that, the whole vibe changed. Suddenly, I've got rights. Suddenly, I can stay in the park. Suddenly, they're offering help. He paused at a street corner, waiting for the light to change. "It shouldn't take being famous to be treated with basic respect," he continued softly. "Everyone deserves that. Every single person." The light changed, and Snoop crossed the street, merging back into the crowd of people who still looked through him rather than at him. Except now, he carried a new understanding of how quickly things could change when your identity, or your perceived worth, shifted in someone's eyes. To everyone's surprise, the officer didn't argue. He looked down for a moment, then back up at Snoop. "You're right," he said quietly. "I didn't see a person. I saw a problem to solve." That simple admission changed the energy of the entire gathering. What could have become confrontational instead opened a door to something more meaningful. "Would you be willing to talk about that?" Snoop asked. "On camera? Not to make you look bad, but to help people understand both sides of this situation." The officer hesitated, then nodded. For the next hour, right there on the sidewalk, something extraordinary happened. Snoop facilitated a conversation between the police officers, people from the day center, and members of the public who had gathered. People shared their perspectives. The officers talked about the challenges of their job, the lack of resources and options. Homeless individuals from the day center spoke about their experiences, the constant moving, the lack of safe spaces to simply exist. And people listened, really listened. "This ain't about villains and heroes," Snoop said as the impromptu community meeting continued. "It's about a system that's broken for everyone. The police don't have the tools to really help. The public doesn't know how to respond. And the people stuck in the middle just keep suffering." As the sun began to set, marking almost exactly 24 hours since Snoop had begun his experiment, he looked around at the diverse group of people who were still talking, still listening to each other. "This is just the beginning of the conversation," he told them. "But it's a start." And as he spoke those words, he knew his experiment had revealed something far more powerful than he had initially imagined. It wasn't just about documenting how police treated the homeless. It was about bringing people together to see each other, really see each other as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The video of Snoop's homeless experiment hit the internet like a storm. Within hours, millions of people had watched it. Regular folks, news channels, and celebrities all shared it on their pages. Everyone was talking about what Snoop had done. People couldn't believe their eyes when they saw how differently the police treated Snoop when they thought he was just another homeless person versus when they realized who he was. The comment sections filled up with thousands of stories from people who had seen similar things happen in their own neighborhoods. 3 days after the video went viral, Snoop appeared on a popular morning TV show. He wasn't wearing his usual flashy clothes, but instead chose something simple and serious. "This wasn't about playing games or making anyone look bad," Snoop explained, leaning forward in his chair. "I wanted to feel what it's really like out there. Man, it opened my eyes. When I was just a homeless guy, some people looked right through me like I wasn't even there." The show played a clip where one store owner had called the cops on Snoop, claiming he was scaring away customers just by sitting quietly with his sign. "That part hurt," Snoop admitted. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. Just existing, you know? And that was enough for someone to want me gone." The Los Angeles Police Department couldn't ignore what had happened. The police chief held a press conference where she stood next to Snoop. "We're using this as a learning moment," she said. "The officers who treated Mr. Broaddus with dignity even when they didn't know who he was, that's the standard we expect. We're making changes to our training based on what we've seen." Those officers, a young woman and an older man who had respectfully asked Snoop to move from the park, were given special recognition. They hadn't known they were being filmed or who they were talking to. They had just done their jobs with kindness. "I was just treating him like I'd want someone to treat my uncle," the female officer said in an interview. "Every person deserves basic respect." Snoop didn't stop there. He put his money where his mouth was. He started a new program called See Me Now that brought police officers and homeless people together for regular community meals. The first one happened 2 weeks after the video, with over 50 officers sitting down with homeless folks to share food and stories. A gray-haired man who had been living on the streets for 8 years stood up during that first dinner. His hands shook as he spoke. "I've been invisible for so long," he said. "Today is the first time in years I felt seen, really seen." 3 police departments in other cities quickly adopted similar programs. Soon, See Me Now dinners were happening across the country. Snoop also funded new mobile shower units that traveled to different homeless areas each day. He showed up regularly, not for publicity but to actually talk with people using the services. 6 months after his experiment, something even bigger happened. The city council approved funding for a new approach to homeless outreach. Teams that paired social workers with specially trained officers. The program aimed to connect people with housing, mental health services, and addiction treatment instead of just moving them along or taking them to jail. "Change is happening," Snoop said in a short documentary that followed up on his experiment 1 year later. "Not fast enough, but it's real." The most surprising outcome came from one of the officers who had been harsh with Snoop. He reached out privately, apologized, and asked to join the outreach teams. By the end of the year, he had become one of the program's strongest supporters. "I needed that wake-up call," the officer admitted. "I'd forgotten why I became a cop in the first place, to help people." The experiment that started as a single day on the streets had grown into something that was changing lives. Real change doesn't happen overnight, but as Snoop liked to say, sometimes all it takes is for someone to really see you. Snoop walked quickly, his mind racing. He had a decision to make. The lieutenant had recognized him, that much was clear. How long before others did too? And what did that mean for his experiment? He pulled out his emergency phone and called his director. "Someone made me," he said quietly. "A police lieutenant. Didn't say it straight out, but the way they started treating me, it was obvious." "Do you want to end it?" the director asked. "We've got plenty of footage already." Snoop paused, watching people hurry past him on the sidewalk. No one looked at him. No one saw him. Except that one officer. "No," he finally said. "I want to flip the script. I think it's time to show everyone who I really am." Back at the day center, Snoop collected his cart and thanked Joe for letting him store it. As he pushed it outside, he noticed 2 police cars parked across the street. The lieutenant was there, talking to several other officers. They weren't being subtle about watching the day center exit. "Here we go," Snoop whispered to himself. He pushed his cart directly toward the gathered officers. He could see their uncertain expressions. Some looked confused about why the lieutenant had called them there. Others kept glancing between Snoop and their superior. "Afternoon, officers," Snoop said as he approached. The lieutenant stepped forward. "Sir, I was wondering if we could talk for a moment." Snoop nodded. "Actually, I was about to come find you. I think it's time we had an honest conversation." A small crowd of passers-by had already started to gather, curious about the homeless man surrounded by police officers. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Snoop glanced around, making sure the hidden cameras were capturing everything. "You know who I am, don't you?" Snoop asked the lieutenant. The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I think I do, but I'm not entirely sure." Snoop smiled. "Let me help you out." With that, he reached up and removed the matted wig that had covered his distinctive braids. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he wiped away some of the fake dirt from his face with a cloth from his pocket. You're Snoop Dogg," one young officer blurted out, his professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. The crowd around them grew instantly larger as people realized what was happening. Phones were raised higher, everyone trying to capture the moment. "Yes, I am," Snoop said, his natural voice replacing the rough tone he'd been using. "For the past day, I've been living on your streets. I've been moved along by some of your fellow officers, threatened by others, and completely ignored by most people." He turned to address not just the officers but the growing crowd. This wasn't about tricking anyone or making anyone look bad. This was about understanding what it's really like out there for people who don't have the choice to go back to a comfortable home like I do. The lieutenant stepped forward. "Mr. Broaddus, I." Snoop held up his hand. "No apologies needed from you. You and your partner treated me with respect, but others didn't, And that's what I want to talk about. By now, the crowd had doubled in size. People were pointing, whispering, some pushing forward to get a better view. Snoop's team had emerged from their hiding spots, cameras now openly filming. When I was just another homeless man, the officers I met this morning threatened to search my belongings for no reason. They told me my existence in a public place was not their problem. But the minute you thought I might be somebody important, he nodded to the lieutenant. Everything changed. Suddenly, I had rights. Suddenly, I deserved respect. The lieutenant looked uncomfortable but didn't disagree. I'm not here to shame anyone, Snoop continued, his voice calm and steady. I'm here to show what happens every day to people who don't have my fame to protect them. He turned to the crowd. How many of you walked past me today? How many crossed the street when you saw me coming? I'm the same person I was 5 minutes ago. The only thing that changed is now you know my name. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Some people looked away, unable to meet his eyes. One of the officers who had confronted Snoop that morning pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. You tricked us, he said. You were playing a role. Snoop shook his head. I wasn't doing anything but sitting quietly when you approached me. You assumed I was a problem because of how I looked. That's the point.